Singapore was a British colony for, more than 100 years. And once we became independent, the government took a decision to keep English as the language of business and the civil service and government. It is the language of the modern sector. To that extent, you find that Singaporeans are modern, Western in orientation. But there is a very large base where the language at home is in Chinese, Malay, Indian regional language, Tamil, Bengali, etc. And the cultural norms at the home is not as obviously Western as Western societies. The cultural heritage is still very strong. The language is English. The cultural heritage is a strong dose of the traditional cultures. And young people, as they move into the modern society, acquire some aspects of the Western cosmopolitan culture. I think if you move around Singaporeans, you'll find different people having different degrees of Westernization. And that's what we are.
Now, thank you.
Each ethnic group is encouraged to go on its own. So you have the Chinese being encouraged to celebrate Chinese New Year, for example, in a big way. There are the Chinese villages. You would have seen a number of them. The Indian, similarly, the Indian villages, Malay villages, and so on. So each ethnic group is encouraged to celebrate. Now, of course, there has been this fear, which has been voiced publicly, that if you encourage them to go separately culturally, you could actually be sowing the seeds of future disunity. But the government feels that this is just one level of Singapore life. If above this, there is unity based on respect for each other, based on a shared economic prosperity, it need not be too bad a thing. So the kind of culture that we are evolving would have to be double layered. The top, shared by all, with the common language being English, really. You know, we communicate with each other in English, even among the Chinese themselves. And this would be, I suppose, bound to Western technology. It would be, in many ways, influenced by the West. And then below this, below, but not necessarily subservient to it, would be the development of our own ethnic cultures. Will these two be synthesized and integrated? We are not quite sure. But if they coexist, that's good enough.
A 1 kilometre-long causeway links Singapore to mainland Malaysia. Like Singapore, Malaysia is multi-ethnic and multi-religious, with Malays in the majority, coexisting with Chinese, Indians and other groups. Malaysia is relatively well off and its economy is booming. But that's where the similarity ends and the contrasts begin. Malaysia's population is almost 6 times that of Singapore's, spread over a land area 500 times the size of Singapore's. It has important natural resources, tin, rubber and oil, as well as a growing agricultural sector. And fishing is one of the traditional occupations that survive as everyday necessities in Malaysia. Meanwhile, just 8 kilometers south across the causeway, you have access to one of the most modern urban transport systems in the world. It took barely 3 years to build Singapore's Mass Rapid Transit System, or MRT. Covering 67 kilometres of track and 42 stations, the system services a large chunk of Singapore's suburbs with their characteristic self-contained housing estates. Satellite towns which, while improving people's living conditions, have also changed traditional patterns of Asian family life. The MRTs relieved congestion in the city centre, part of which is restricted to traffic during peak travel hours. Improving the infrastructure is one way of optimizing resources, another is education.
Because human resource development is so important to us, that a lot of emphasis has been placed on education. In the 1960s and the early 1970s, the emphasis was on primary education, and that was really to educate a large mass of people, and especially the young people. Then when that was largely fulfilled by about the early to the mid-70s, the emphasis then switched to secondary education and then also to technical education. Now, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the emphasis is on tertiary education, more specialist education, and so on, and hence we find that we are now going to have 3 universities, where 10 years ago we only had 1.
The political leadership over the last 25 to 30 years have given emphasis to supporting those who are able. In other words, if you have the ability, more should be given to you. Resources should be spent on you. This is because Singapore is seen to be a country that is very small, with 2.7 million people, 3 million including visitors, the transients. Resource is of the highest premium, so we must develop this human resource. At the same time, while saying that we believe that those who are able should be helped, I think Singapore also helps those who are less able. We draw a bottom line. Resources are spent on creating a viable and a good school system, education system, to help those who are not as quick in learning. But the question is whether one should neglect those who are able because one is afraid of stepping out and of appearing to be elitist. I think in Singapore, we believe in helping those who are able. It is meritocracy rather than elitism.
Okay, dear. On to my quiz now. So we have taught J-Area how to maneuver and to catch food thrown high up into the air.
An amazing variety of parks and zoological gardens provide another source of knowledge linked with entertainment and open to all and sundry. The Jurong Bird Park has more than 4,500 birds and includes a 2-hectare walk-in aviary. It's amazing how adaptable polar bears can be, isn't it? As for the apes, well, life here is just one big party.
We are a mix of the old and the new, a mix of East and West. In many ways, we have a Western face. The city skyline is very Western, but our soul is very Asian. And in that sense, I think we have great tourism appeal.